Michael will be starting the event shortly. We're just allowing some time for people to join the link, if you're wondering.
Hello.
Hello, Michael. Yeah, we're just allowing some time for people to get onto the live stream, so we'll start in a couple minutes.
Sure. Sorry for
no problem.
Sorry for a bit last minute stress.
No problem at all. Just yeah, at the moment, just maybe mute your microphone for a couple minutes, and then I'll request to turn on your video.
Okay. And for my slides, do you need me to?
Later, when we come to the event has started properly, Milan will hand over to you to do your speech first after his introduction, and then just share your screen, share your slides. Just using the share screen function when it comes to it.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Yeah, we're now starting our event of today. So really, I hope you're all well and safe in this difficult time between, well, protests and in the middle of a pandemic. And so really thank you for joining us today for the Oxford Climate Society event, one of many events this term. So we've started a couple of weeks ago, and there will be a couple of more in the coming weeks. Yeah, I'm Milan Klöver. I'm the outgoing education coordinator at the Oxford Climate Society. And I'm also a PhD student in climate modeling here in Oxford. And yeah, recently I've been because, well, being in academia, I've been trying to decarbonize academia, especially when it comes to conference travels. And so I really have been trying to advocate always for virtual conferences. And suddenly, well, in the middle of a pandemic, a couple of months later, here we are in the middle of now completely fully virtual Oxford Climate Society seminar series. And yeah, the Oxford Climate Society is a part of the Oxford University, run by students to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders, as we always phrase it. And so usually in addition to our weekly events, which are now completely virtual, we also, for example, organize the, well, quite famous now Oxford School of Climate Change, which is like a climate change 101 seminar series for students, but basically open for everyone who wants to have a broader background in climate change. We also run the world's largest student-run climate journal, Anthroposphere, and are currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and incorporate climate change into the Oxford curriculum. Today, we want to discuss with you the impact of flying on climate change, and in more general terms, pathways towards sustainable aviation. And so I will give just a short introduction to the topic, then introduce the speakers, and then we will open up with opening speeches from both speakers, and then we basically start our discussion and then have some questions from your side. So flying really has become, yeah, a staple of the modern globalized world, right? So clearly it has enabled international and also a lot of intercultural communication over the last decades, but actually mostly for the global north, because you just have to look on flight tracker and you will see that the global north is flying and not the global south. So the carbon emissions of aviation is a hotly debated topic. And although the transport sector is responsible for about a quarter of the global emissions, aviation is only a small fraction of this, maybe like 10% or so. So aviation itself is just responsible for 3, maybe if you include other indirect factors, you can go up to like a couple of more percent, but we're basically talking about actually like a small fraction of the global emissions, right? So the question obviously clearly arises, like, why do we care so much about flying? And why don't we look at the elephant in the room, which might be other sectors? And the point is that the carbon emissions of flying are about 10 times higher than if you take a car. However, we usually also fly 10 times farther, so the distance is much further than if you sit in a car, right? So in rough terms, you could think of this as that flying is 100 times worse for climate than actually sitting in a car, very roughly speaking. And this is only for the economy class, right? So once we talk about business or first class, this factor of 100 easily becomes like a factor of 200 or 300. And so you can clearly already see that there is a certain inequality in transport. And although we have about 4 billion passengers flying every year, so this pre-lockdown, obviously, you may think that the half of the world population actually has an access to airplanes, but well, this is not really true, because some people actually fly many, many times a year. And so exact numbers are very hard to come by, but probably not more than a couple of percent of the world's population actually flies in a given year. And for those that fly regularly, flying is by far the highest carbon footprint activity. So just like a typical flight, let's say from London to New York, easily accounts for more than a third of the annual emission of the average UK citizen. And I mean, if you compare that to many other people in different countries of the world, that is way beyond their annual emissions. Flights in general are taken for many different reasons. So there could be business, but also leisure, holidays, and seeing family. And we could definitely have a whole argument about whether some of these reasons are more essential than others. However, and I still just want to point this out, that income is still probably the best predictor for the numbers of flights taken by an individual. And so in very rough terms, the more money someone has, the more likely they are to have a very high travel carbon footprint, at least on average. Aviation is one of the fastest growing emission sectors. That is, for different reasons, also very, very difficult to decarbonize, and we will definitely go into some of the details later. But now, due to the pandemic, the aviation industry is actually in a really, really big crisis, probably the biggest crisis since the beginning of aviation. And although before COVID-19, the numbers of passengers were expected to double within the next 15 years or so, this obviously has to be questioned now. And currently, the numbers of passengers are down by 70, 80, 90%. And I mean, if you probably have all seen these pictures of almost no airplanes over Europe anymore, obviously this is taken up again. And so the industry is probably, well, deeply hoping to get back to business as usual, so that obviously the whole job securities come back and so on and so forth. But you also have all heard about these stories where basically national governments try to subsidize the aviation industry, so to avoid airlines from going bankrupt. And so the big question that we want to address today is that how can we continue flying while also mitigating climate change? And this then, yeah, the whole idea of like, what does it mean for the aviation industry? How is sustainable aviation possible? What would actually sufficiently sustainable mean in the climate, in the climate sense? And then more general, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, how will COVID-19 actually affect our attitude towards flying? Not just now, but also in the coming years. And so we have invited two experts today. One is Adam Korber, and the other one is Michael Gill. Michael is the director of the aviation environment of the International Air Transport Association, where he leads their sustainable regulation and policy advocacy with governments, the UN, and business partners. He's also the executive director of the Air Transport Action Group in Geneva, leading their work to promote the aviation industry's sustainable growth. He has decades of experience in the aviation sector, and he played a leadership role in the adoption of the International Agreement on Aviation and Climate Change, CORSIA, in 2016, that we will definitely hear more about in a second. And then our second expert is Adam Korber, who leads the sustainable and energy section at the Cadmus Group, which is an environmental consultancy firm. And he also leads the sustainable aviation team for the Rocky Mountain Institute. Really leading their global initiative to decarbonize aviation. He also writes for Forbes on aviation and the environment, and was previously head of the sustainable aviation for ICF International. So really, thank you, Michael and Evan, for joining us today. And so just to remind everyone, the following is approximately the following, that we will have roughly, well, a bit less now than 1 hour and 30 minutes. And both speakers will start with an opening speech, introduce themselves and the current state of sustainable aviations and their opinions. And then I will follow up with some questions, well, addressing more than the future of aviation and a couple of other questions. Dear audience, I always encourage you to ask questions at any time in the live chat. So I think that's on your right side. So you can just post your questions there. And we will basically try to include these questions as best as possible into the whole discussion. You can obviously ask these questions as early as possible, and we can try to accommodate these. And as we are very international, hopefully very international discussion today, you can also just type in like, hey, I'm tuning in from here and there, to really see what range we actually have. That would be super interesting, especially because, well, virtual panels, virtual conferences are one way of reducing actually the amount that we fly. So we really would like to, Michael, to start. So the floor is yours. You can share your screen. He has prepared a couple of slides, and I'm handing over to Michael.
Milan, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm afraid I'm having trouble sharing my slides for some reason. So let's not waste any time on that. But I'll talk you through the points I was hoping to make in the presentation. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. Really delighted to join you, if only in a virtual format. I would much prefer to have been able to get on a plane to come to the UK, to Oxford, and meet with you all in person, of course. But nonetheless, this is a great opportunity for us all to meet and discuss what is a really important issue. We are, as you said, as an aviation industry, in the eye of the storm of as you described, probably the greatest crisis the industry's ever faced. I'm sitting here at Geneva Airport looking out over the runway, and there are no aircraft getting ready to take off any time for the rest of the day. And it is really quite a striking sight to see. But I say that we're in the midst of a crisis. We also, as everyone is aware, are in the midst of a much longer term, probably much more humanity-threatening crisis, which relates to climate change. And that's why we have to continue to take a long-term strategic approach to all industries' impact on climate, and aviation is no different from anyone else in that regard. And in fact, it's an issue we as an industry have looked at going back to 2008. We realized that, yes, we were responsible for around 2% of global man-made CO2 emissions, and that was a number which was set to grow in the coming decades. So in 2008, the airlines, working with industry partners from manufacturers, from airports, from the organizations in charge of air traffic management, they got together around some collective climate change goals, the first ever industry sector to do so on a global basis. Just to summarize them briefly, in the short term, from 2009 out to 2020, this year, we had pledged to improve our fuel efficiency by 1.5% on average per year. And that's a target which we've surpassed by quite some distance. Our midterm commitment is to stabilize our net CO2 emissions at the levels that they are this year in 2020. And that's through the CORSIA agreement that Milan mentioned a moment ago. But looking long term, and I think really where I'd like to focus my thoughts, looking long term, we have a commitment to reduce by 2050 our net CO2 emissions to 50% of what they were in 2005. And just to give you an idea of the order of magnitude that we're talking about, that means that by 2050, we want to be down to around 325 million tons of CO2 per year. In 2005, we were at around 650. Today, we're getting close to 950 million tons. So there's a big gap that needs to be met in the next 30 years if we're to meet that long-term target that we as a global sector have set. And we can discuss as well how that fits in with greater ambition, particularly under the Paris Agreement, to look to net zero emissions targets. So those are the goals we set. How are we going about getting there? How have we managed, first of all, to meet the short-term fuel efficiency improvement? That's through the new aircraft fleet, new engine technology. The new aircraft that you're flying on, or hopefully have been flying on until fairly recently, are anything up to 25% more fuel efficient than the aircraft models that they represent. And that as they gradually are introduced into the world's fleet, those improvements continue. There's also a range of operational methods that airlines, hidden operational methods, if you like, that the passenger doesn't necessarily see, but things like lightweighting, everything on board the aircraft, from seats to catering trolleys to pilot manuals, operating, taxiing at the airport itself, only using one engine or using an electric taxiing technology. These kind of operational measures bring around significant improvement as well. There's a lot happening at the moment in alternative fuels, and I'll go into that in just a bit more detail in a moment. How we're going to meet the midterm goal is through the CORSIA agreement. That's a global offsetting mechanism whereby airlines will offset any growth in their emissions above 2020 levels, and that's under the umbrella of our International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, which is the UN body regulating international aviation. And that offsetting will allow us to at least maintain emissions at 2020 levels until the longer term technology developments can come and deploy their full effect. And the biggest, I think the biggest single prospect that we see for those long-term emissions reductions is through the use of alternative fuels. So that is aviation fuel emanating from sources other than fossil fuel. And there are now 7 approved pathways to produce aviation fuel from renewable sources, whether that's municipal solid waste, whether that's used cooking oil, whether it's other chemical processes which produce aviation fuel without having to resort to fossil sources. There's huge potential there. At the moment, we have less than 1% of the world's aviation fuel supply coming from sustainable aviation fuel. We think that in the next decade, the potential is there for that to increase to 2%, and then we're well on the way there's a momentum to even greater deployment. The challenge with alternative fuels is, of course, one of cost. We just don't have the production levels at the moment to be able to produce those fuels at anything close to cost parity with conventional jet fuel. And be happy to discuss later on how we think that very difficult vicious circle can be broken to allow us to see more and more alternative fuels coming into the supply chain in the years to come. I want to leave as much time as possible for Q&A, so I'm going to pause my initial introduction there. But the overriding message, I think, is that we as an aviation sector have recognized for over a decade now that we have a significant impact on climate change. We've taken a very proactive and ambitious approach to addressing it by setting targets that we're going to meet, and having in place a very clear strategic plan which involves collaboration from everybody in the sector. This isn't just about airlines. This involves contributions from airlines, manufacturers, airports, and air traffic management. And we have a very clear strategy in place. What we need now is a greater buy-in from government through policy support, more and more investment into the growing alternative fuels sector, and frankly, through engagements like this, a better understanding within the general public and within the flying public of exactly what it is that aviation is doing to try and address its climate change impact. So let me pause there, Milan, and I look forward to the Q&A in just a moment. Thank you.
Great, Michael. Thanks so much for giving this introduction to your opinions. I probably already have a couple of questions in my mind that I would like to ask, but before I do that, it's obviously Adam's turn. So please, Adam, the floor is yours for your opening speech.
Great. Thank you very much, Milan. Thank you, Michael. It's a great opportunity to talk to your audience today. I work for the Cadmus Group, but I currently also support the Rocky Mountain Institute. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a presentation deck here. And hopefully this comes through. All right. So can people see this? You can just put a thumbs up if it works.
Yep, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Okay, so a little bit about RMI as a player and contributor to global climate action. RMI was founded over 35 years ago in Colorado by Amory Lovins and Hunter Lovins. The focus of the group has always been to drive market-based solutions. So how can we work within the business network, within the systems as they exist, and to make some changes using economics, using the best engineering and technology that's available, and unlocking solutions when there are barriers. So there already are a number of positive developments when it comes to aviation. Michael has listed a number of them through technology and through operations. The one challenge that we have focused on as a think and do tank is to how can we unlock additional capital to support that aviation fuel, the sustainable fuel price gap. That price premium, as Michael mentioned, has this vicious circle, a chicken and egg, where we won't have investors put up the money unless those lenders and investors believe that the airlines can purchase the fuel. And this is the aviation industry has very low margins. It's highly competitive. Airlines have limited ability to take on a price gap of 2x and more for the sustainable fuels. So we've been focused on that, and we started as a group to looking at where are some new sources or new players to contribute capital? And we are not afraid to fail. And I'll be the first to admit that our first approach, which focused on airports as the new agents within the ecosystem and finding ways for the airports to support this price premium, didn't work out, because ultimately the revenue from aviation really is based first through the airlines. And by extension, if the airports are using their capital, they're really using the airline capital at its heart. So because of that structural challenge, we learned many lessons, and we saw that this is not necessarily the right avenue. So what did we do instead? So we, in San Francisco, and this is the value of in-person meetings, we met with Christoph Wolf, my colleague Ned Harvey, and myself at the Global Climate Action Summit. And if people are not familiar with that venue, it's a group of non-state actors, so not the countries themselves or the NDCs, but businesses and sub-state level, such as the United States, could be provinces in other countries or states in the US, companies. What can they do to contribute to elective climate action? And through that conversation at Davos in 2019, there was a meeting focused on aviation and figuring out what can be done, what can the private industry do additionally to make a change. And the focus was clearly on sustainable fuels. That's the area that needs the most attention. And from that conversation in 2019, the CEOs and their number twos that were there agreed to Clean Skies for Tomorrow. And Clean Skies for Tomorrow is a broad group of coalition of the willing and of leaders in the industry from aviation, but also this is a key contribution for Clean Skies. It involves the demand sector too. So we've got the large corporate buyers of passenger and air freight travel who are now directly involved in the conversation and are interested in making a change. So you can see there are 5 subgroups or work streams. The RMI in my group is in charge of the scaling a marketplace for SAF. We're also calling that the demand signal. And you can see we actually have some other key partners here with the World Economic Forum. We have McKinsey, who's leading a couple of the work streams, including looking at the feasibility of feedstock. And I think there's a question of, can we reach the targets beyond 2% and 2% that Michael mentioned? And through their analysis, it supports, yes, we can scale up. We can potentially replace all of the liquid fuels that are going into aviation with sustainable fuels by 2050. It won't be easy. And there are some other elements too, besides looking at a marketplace. There's a policy support group that's led by the Energy Transitions Commission, and that's a UK-based think and do tank as well. And you may be familiar with their Mission Possible report. Part of the impetus or motivation of building this group was based on how do you address those industries or sectors where there isn't necessarily an economic case. So that's clear in aviation, where the cost of decarbonizing the fuel itself doesn't make sense from a bottom line perspective, but we really need to do it. So can we unlock some new tools to do that? And then lastly, a new work stream is finance, and how can we cover the commercial production facilities? Can we de-risk individual investments? Can we pool the risk by having a new mechanism where there's an investment across all of the startups and all of the different sustainable aviation fuel companies? That's also in the process of lifting off. All right, so I'm not going to go into detail here. The key component here of these milestones is that we are also working with climate NGOs. One of the drivers for the corporations that are involved is they really want to be recognized as global leaders and to adopt best practices. And currently, offsets are seen as a measure of last resort. Can you decarbonize or get to science-based targets, reduce your emissions by 50% by 2030 or net zero by 2050? Can you do that within the sector? And sustainable fuels can get you there, offsets can't. So part of our program is engaging directly to look at the scope 3 methodology to figure out if we can create an innovation there. And then also to look at science-based targets and receive or obtain recognition that sustainable fuels are a viable solution so that the corporations can feel confident pursuing sustainable fuels. And here is a little bit of background about what is going into our solution. We're trying to build an analog to, if people are familiar with the renewable energy credits. So the electricity market has an additional mechanism or investments that can be made based on the fact that the electricity is produced from wind or solar, and this helps the investor get some of their money back. The difference is with the REC, that unit is not necessarily additional. The investment can be made without it. It's a nice bonus, and it's helped to grow the industry on the voluntary side. On the compliance side, it's helped in the US, states meet their renewable energy targets and requirements. So there's a compliance and a voluntary side. What we think for the SAF-C or Sustainable Aviation Fuel credits, that will be purely voluntary and additional to what CORSIA contributes. Oops, and then just a little bit about the pricing Michael had mentioned before. Currently, the most cost competitive alternative fuel is at least 2x the price of jet fuel, of kerosene. And that is after government subsidies. So you can see how the SAF-C solution might work. The first chunk of money is covered by the government. Maybe that's roughly equivalent to the feedstock cost. Michael had mentioned that used cooking oil right now is one of the more cost competitive technologies and where the majority of the production volume is coming from. So can the government cover that? And then some additional payments come in where there's a carbon value from the sustainable fuels, and that could be covered by the airline towards CORSIA or beyond CORSIA. And then the corporation can unlock the fuel, can cover the differential with what we're calling the SAF-C credit. And so this is what it looks like in terms of flows. So you've got scope 1 direct emissions and scope 3. The scope 3 attributes then are purchased by the corporation. Scope 1 are purchased by the airline, and the fuel volume also flows the same way or potentially independently from the scope 1. One of the benefits of a book and claim method or a virtual transaction is you can actually secure volume from where it is most cost competitive, least costly, and the least carbon intensive. So if you're flying in Europe and there's no production capacity available right now on the continent, you could purchase from a facility in California where there is already a supply chain in place and the molecules don't have to travel very far. And also, this is a schematic of how it could work in terms of buyers and sellers. Again, this is a voluntary system, and you can see the division of the scope 1 and scope 3 attributes at the end. And to bolster confidence, there needs to be documentation and a registry so that there's an avoidance of double claiming. We definitely think that all the pieces are in place to make this work. We just have to get agreement and get our product out there. As mentioned before, there's an opportunity to cover both scope 1 and scope 3. We'll make sure that this aligns with CORSIA. So the requirements around sustainability, what goes into that fuel to make sure that it actually is carbon beneficial, that it minimizes impacts that are social to the workers. So there's a social aspect, or minimizes impact to water quality and water quantity. We will make sure that we adhere to CORSIA on that. And then we will also be working with the NGOs, again, to achieve recognition that this really is a best practice. And this also enables innovators such as Compensate from Lufthansa or Board Now from Sky Energy. They can fit within the SAF-C and then be recognized with a global registry. To come from the angle with some good news, we've got this brewing, and it's still moving forward despite the challenges with the pandemic and the current economic challenges with aviation. I'll end with that and open it up to questions.
Yeah, I think you have to stop your screen sharing now.
Got it.
Perfect. Yes, great. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for these opening speeches. That was very, very interesting. So if I get this correct, at the moment we have not more than 1% of sustainable fuels used. And there's actually like the current potential, let's say within the next decade, I think, Michael, you said this was probably like, I don't know, increasing that to like 2% or so. But so we really like, I mean, we're definitely not talking about, at the moment, we're not talking about like a significant replacement of kerosene by sustainable fuels, but really like about a small chunk. And then Adam clearly like showed us that actually, if we would increase our ambitions, it would be possible by the end of 2050 to really go for completely sustainable fuels. But as far as I understand it, there's like Corsia is kind of tries to have this compromise between being somewhat ambitious, but then also keeping the industry as happy as possible because of, well, kerosene is just much cheaper at the moment than sustainable fuels. And so I think my first question then goes to Michael in terms of, so at the moment, airlines really, if they want to be net zero, they would rely on carbon offsetting. I think it was EasyJet that maybe like half a year ago or so announced that they want to carbon offset everything. And so our airlines, or let's say the whole global aviation industry, would they actually benefit? Would they actually like to have a global tax on kerosene to make basically to have like an equal competition for everyone? Because as far as I know, at the moment, kerosene is differently taxed depending on where you are, right? In Europe, there is basically no tax on kerosene, whereas in other countries and continents, there are different taxes on that. So would a global tax on kerosene actually help the industry to transit to sustainable fuels?
Well, I mean, theoretically, yes, it could, but I guess there's two important points to bear in mind with that. Firstly, the exemptions on taxation on aviation kerosene are contained in a whole series of bilateral agreements between states, and to unpick the tens of thousands of those agreements, you can imagine that complex network. To unpick the tens of thousands of those agreements and try and come up with a global agreement for a kerosene tax, I think would take years, if not decades. I mean, the Corsia agreement took well over 10 years of negotiation, and there was at least a recognition of a starting point that we were moving from. So I don't see that as a realistic prospect. The second point is there is a bit of a myth that the airlines don't pay tax, which is simply not true. They don't pay tax on fuel on international flights. They pay tax on fuel on domestic flights, but they also pay a whole range of other corporate taxes, just like any other corporate entity in the economy. I don't think the focus here should be on using taxation as the stick, which is somehow going to drive us towards deployment of SAF. There are a whole lot of carrots out there that governments can adopt, incentives that governments can implement through policy mechanisms that will get us to break what I describe as the vicious circle on SAF.
Adam, you look like you want to jump in right on that.
Yeah, I think in terms of if we do the reverse, we can eliminate subsidies to conventional petroleum. That would help. And there are some measures that have shown, or some analysis that's shown, that a carbon tax or that is applied broadly can be an effective measure. And if you are familiar with the En-ROADS model from MIT, that shows that of all the different measures, that one seems to have the most impact. But that's from a systems perspective. From an aviation perspective, probably, as Michael said, it's challenging when you are looking at international taxes. Can there be some way we can move faster? And one of the ways that we can move faster is eliminating the subsidies to conventional petroleum fuels. That would help. And also eliminating potential taxes for sustainable fuels for domestic travel. That would be a benefit too. So conversely, elimination of some taxes could be very helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, both of you mentioned that there is some kind of dependency on like airlines being like part of a global aviation industry. So actually getting to like a global agreement, as you said, Michael, would probably take decades, if not longer, in comparison to the time it took for the COSIA agreement. But I was then wondering, because now COVID basically has brought up a completely different situation where previously it was national governments obviously try to try to support the aviation industry as much as possible. And one of the results of that is basically the non-existing kerosene tax that you mentioned, Michael. That is like, I mean, decades ago now, but that this started. But due to COVID, is there now, because suddenly airlines are really dependent on money from the national governments to not get bankrupt, is there actually, how much more is the aviation industry now dependent on national governments since COVID-19? And will this somehow result in national regulations for airlines that would not have been in place, let's say half a year ago before COVID?
I mean, firstly, on the fuel tax exemption, my understanding of, and this was enshrined from the very early days of international aviation law, it wasn't so much governments trying to give indirect financial support to airlines. It was a very practical difficulty, which was to which country would you attribute the fuel uploaded and then burned in the course of an international journey, which may cover a number of jurisdictions, and the complexity of trying to do that and tax fuel accordingly by each individual jurisdiction was seen as being extremely difficult, extremely problematic, and it's actually a form of a mutual exemption from all of the different countries, which puts that in place. Just to clarify that, on the issue of government support in the context of COVID, I mean, what we've seen really are two main forms of financial support to the airlines. The first is in the form of wage support to staff on a temporary basis. And we think that's very important from an operational regulatory perspective, because it's absolutely crucial once the restrictions on travel are lifted, it's absolutely crucial that we have the necessary skilled staff still working within the sector, airlines, airports, air traffic controllers, etc., to be able to get the system restarted and recovering. The second is really in the form of loans, low interest loans from governments. And we haven't really seen too many, if I can put it, green strings being attached to those loans. I believe that's for two reasons. Firstly, because I think there is a general sense that regulating in haste in the midst of a crisis is never a good way to go. It's not the correct or appropriate method by which you adopt any form of national regulation. But secondly, I think many countries, and we've seen this in France, we've seen it in Germany, many countries have recognized that it would be unnecessary to attach those green conditions, because they're talking about loans to an aviation industry, which, as I described, have actually taken a pretty proactive and strategic approach. Now, yes, we can always drive towards greater ambition. It's one of the messages which we continue to deliver to governments, but we already do have, the airlines already do have in place this long-term emissions reduction target. And therefore, attaching additional green conditions is almost unnecessary.
Maybe I just directly drop in here a question from the audience, which is, given that virtually all airlines fight for survival, aren't climate goals now merely lip service to be bailed out rather than an imperative high priority issue?
I think you've got to look at it in the short term and in the long term. And when I say short term, we're looking at the next weeks, potentially months out to the end of 2020. Yes, the priority of the carriers is on survival. There's no question for that. I don't think any industry would be criticized for trying to survive and emerge from this crisis in the most robust way possible. But looking beyond that, there is no question, and this is a clear message we've been given from the member airlines of IATA, there's no question that their long-term commitment to climate action continues. And 2050 is 3 decades away. There's a lot that can happen between now and then. We think that traffic is going to recover to pre-COVID levels probably around 2022, 2023. Even in the run-up to that, it's going to be absolutely fundamental that the industry takes the steps it needs to address its long-term challenge. So these were difficult challenges 6 months ago. They're going to be difficult challenges 6 months from now.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So you clearly addressed this, that the industry really wants to and expects to go back to business. Adam, do you think this is like in the whole perspective of, at the moment, there's a lot of emissions, they're increasing, there might be some sustainable fuels available soon. However, there are also other ways to reduce the emissions of a whole industry, which is at the moment, obviously, the industry is basically, the success of the industry is basically measured by their financial success. So like income, what the revenue of a company and so on and so forth. But would there be other ways to actually measure the sustainable growth to basically keep investors happy, so that basically economically the whole industry could be sustainable? But yeah, what does it mean in terms of sustainable growth? Are there other ways to actually aim for towards a net zero emission target for 2050?
Yeah, so something that's been discussed is ticket price. It is expensive to decarbonize aviation. If you were to purchase the fuels at the lowest cost right now, which would be delivered in California, a ticket would be about 40 to 50% more. So that is significantly higher if you were to completely cover your fuel, and that would maybe cover about 80% of your emissions. So if you were to purchase additional fuel on top of that, the ticket rate rises by 50% or more. So what could be the balance? If flying is going to be more expensive, who are the parties that can pay that differential, that premium? Potentially the business travelers have the greater capacity to do that, say professional service firms, such as the major accounting firms, the major management consulting firms. They have more capacity to pay. If they start to pay a larger share for their tickets, it's possible some of their travel demand may go down, but that would potentially help to internalize the true cost or environmental impact of their flying and mitigate it. So one of the questions is, what is the willingness of passengers to pay more? Can we socialize that concept and have people not just race for the lowest cost ticket, but to actually purchase a sustainable ticket? So I think that is something that's worth discussing, is how can we promote the additional purchase and cost for a higher price ticket that would be on sustainable fuels?
Yeah, very, very, very interesting question. So, I mean, basically my question that I already wrote down on that is really that, yeah, how would an aviation industry react to measures like a frequent flyer tax, right? So I addressed a little bit the inequality in flying in the beginning, and you clearly made the point that actually the whole industry is very reliant on these business first class travelers that pay way more. However, we also always have to see that they take up much more space in an airplane. So actually, if you look at the carbon footprint of such a person, they consume so much more. And if, I mean, obviously, if an airline would suddenly say like, oh, we only have economy seats, that's it, basically the per capita carbon footprint of the travelers would definitely drop. And it's a question of whether this could be an alternative way to basically measure the success in the sense of we're also respecting the climate. But how much would that actually then, like, is aviation possible without such a huge divide between economy that doesn't pay much and first class that pays a lot? And maybe this question can directly go together with Adam's question to Michael then.
I mean, I have a perspective on that. Aviation in the US until the 80s and in Europe until the 90s was a heavily regulated industry, and there was a general movement towards deregulation, which has brought, I think, significant benefits, not just to us as an industry, but to the broader economy. It's democratized air travel in a way which people could never have imagined. And what you're talking about, to me, sounds very much like a move back towards regulation. So who would determine who a frequent flyer is? Who would determine whether travel is essential, if you want to get into that area? Who would determine what's an economy seat and what's a business class seat? How would you grade different levels of customer service or product differentiation between airlines? It seems to me, as I say, you're getting very close back to regulation, and I'm not sure. I'm certainly not sure a lot of the world's populations would be happy with their governments making those kind of decisions on their behalf. And the way, I guess, just to go back to Adam's point, Adam, you've been talking about how we pay the differential between conventional and sustainable aviation fuel. What I always think we should focus on is not how do you pay the differential, how do we create a market, but how do we create a market dynamic where there is no differential anymore? And that brings me back to this role of government in policy development on SAF. There simply isn't a level playing field at the moment. There are incentives given to the road transport industry in certain jurisdictions which aren't given to aviation. There are a number of very good examples. California is one, the UK is another, where governments have taken specific policy decisions with regard to aviation and SAF, and they're beginning to bear fruit. But there are lots of other countries in the world where it's extremely difficult for that cost differential to be reduced anytime soon. And that's why we continue to call on governments to adopt those kind of policy levers that will incentivize it. And emerging from COVID, we think is a great opportunity for that. As governments are looking, and I'll just finish on this, as governments are looking to regenerate economies, to create market stimulus, investment of public money into a SAF project, brand new industry, new jobs created, is actually a fantastic win-win opportunity to regenerate your economy whilst also encouraging the deployment of this sustainable energy source for the aviation sector.
Adam, you want to follow up on that directly, or?
Yeah, I agree that the ultimate prize is price parity. From what we have seen at RMI and looking at the economic analysis, it looks like that differential is going to exist and persist for a while, even with tremendous increased investments on the public sector side. So acknowledging that and also understanding that we have an urgent need to act now, we believe that we need to find new ways to unlock capital to get these early investments. As people that are participating on this workshop probably know, if you got your first production plant, you're going to have higher costs and you will realize efficiencies when you create your second plant. Well, we only have one dedicated global production facility right now that's operational on a continuous basis. So can we get more of these plants going? When these entrepreneurs, the business owners, start building their second plants, they're going to realize efficiencies. It will in turn reduce the price of the fuel. And that there will be supply chains that are set up that will reduce logistical costs. So we do need to get to scale. And we see that there's a definite role for voluntary capital in conjunction with these public sector investments to help move things quickly, because it takes 5 years or more to start a new commercial production facility. And that timeline requires patient capital, but also requires as much money upfront as we can generate.
There's one question from the YouTube channel that got voted up quite a lot, and as Michael, as I understand, you also have to leave us in a few minutes. This is a question for you, and I think basically goes on the lines of, we have heard that in the news that there were, especially at the beginning of COVID, there was a couple of like empty airplanes flying around the world, basically because there were some regulations, because otherwise they would lose their slot. And so this question especially addresses here, what about the effects of fuel tankering? So carrying excess fuel at cheap prices. would IATA consider telling member airlines to not practice this inefficient operational policy? And so I think in general, whether the IATA is willing to, although economically it makes sense, let's say for an airline to carry more excess fuel or to have some kind of regulations to preserve slots and so on, whether IATA is actually willing to put more regulations onto the airlines simply because we want to reduce emissions.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, let's not mistake what IATA's role is. We're a representative association of the airlines. We develop policy positions and advocacy, and we provide a whole range of services for the airlines. So we're not in a position to tell any of our members what they should and shouldn't be doing. And issues like this very much are down to the individual commercial decisions of an airline and how they manage their operations. What I would say is, I think the overall impact of tankering is relatively marginal. It only really applies to certain regions where it's a realistic possibility, and it's particularly in Europe. So whilst it's an important issue, I'm not sure that it's globally speaking as significant as some of the other topics that we've covered off here. And I wouldn't overemphasize its significance. But what it goes back to my original remarks, which is that there are a whole range of different operational methods which airlines can take, which do improve their fuel efficiency and at the same time avoid fuel burn and therefore save them money. And that's lightweighting the aircraft. It's using continuous descent approaches. It's only taxiing on one engine at the runway. And so what we do as IATA is to try and promote them as best practices across the sector. And I think we've done it successfully because we have seen this significant improvement in fuel efficiency over the last decade or so.
Whenever we talk about fuel efficiency, I think, Adam, you mentioned that basically every fuel efficiency is kind of immediately compensated because then lowers the prices, that makes it possible for the airlines to allow cheaper tickets, and so basically just incentivizes people to fly more. What do we talk about when we actually mean sustainable growth of the aviation industry? So is it really like following like a business model where you always try to maximize your profit, or and this is the question that comes from the audience, does the aviation industry aim to further grow? Is continuous growth questioned given that it will always eliminate efficiency gains? Should we talk about sufficiency and not per passenger emissions?
You want to take this first?
I mean, Adam, you're also welcome to give the first answer on that. Yeah,
I'm happy to take that one. I mean, yes, it's clearly not about growth just for growth's sake, but I also think you have to realize that as aviation is growing, it's not just about growing the airlines business. It's growing economies and connected industries and businesses elsewhere in the economy. And so aviation is, the international business par excellence, and it's the connectivity that we provide to the world that governments are really interested in. It's latching onto the connectivity and the secondary economic development that aviation provides, which I think is really important. So it's not just about us growing; it's us growing and allowing for economic development across the sector. The thing about the point around growth of cheap flying, I mean, again, it goes back to that point I made. Who is it that decides whether travel is essential? And of course, what may seem like a non-essential flight, of course, is somebody flying to then spend money in another country, allow that economy to develop, support jobs, travel and tourism, etc. So I think I'd always urge people to take a very much holistic approach to that question. It's not just about you can't just look at the year-on-year growth of the airline business in isolation.
Yeah, very, very interesting, very interesting. Adam,
can I add one thing to that, Milan?
Yes, please.
So a climate luminary in the United States is James Hansen, and he has said that aviation is part of the climate solution. Why? Because we have to get people in the same room. And I have to say, this COVID crisis has reinforced that with me. We've had the innovations and breakthroughs with Clean Skies and with RMI, when we've been able to have the stakeholders together participating face-to-face discussion. There really is no substitute. Zoom meetings are excellent for getting the information out. This is an effective use of the technology platform. But in terms of consultation, negotiation, trust building, you really need to get people in the same room.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, especially because now we're getting used to doing everything virtual. So there's clearly the question arising whether there will be some kind of a new normal of business communication, of, let's say, academic communication, where the default is just to do it Zoom, and only if you're like, oh, sorry, yeah, actually maybe we should talk about this in person, then basically the second choice is, okay, let's catch an airplane. And I mean, Michael, you clearly said that there's a big discussion about what means essential travel, and you also said in the beginning you would have loved to come to Oxford to discuss that with us in person. I kind of have the feeling it works actually quite well like this, but yeah, clearly there is a question around what is essential travel, and apparently you're not denying that. So yeah, what are your comments on that? That I mean, you clearly say that there is a difference between different types of travel, but I mean, obviously leaving that open to whoever decides that, but it's like first question if, and then the question of how, right?
Yeah, let me take that. And Milan, again, apologies. This is going to have to be my last intervention, and then I have to drop off.
Yes, that's fine.
Yes, as I said, you can distinguish different kinds of travel, but my question is, on whose authority is it to decide whether or not any of them are essential or not essential, and what may not seem essential to you? You know, a short haul trip to travel home to see family in a different part of the world doesn't sound essential until you realize that it's to see an elderly relative who is in ill health. That would very much be essential. It's an extremely subjective question, and I'm just not sure how you would ever construct any framework which would allow for anything sensible to come out of that. On the topic of business travel, I mean, firstly, let's be honest, the technology that has been developed in recent years is absolutely fantastic. Can you imagine how awful this lockdown would have been without the level of technology that we've seen? But I don't honestly believe long-term it's going to impact or reduce all business travel. You know, these solutions have existed for a few years, and yet nonetheless, people have decided to travel to do business. And I think, as Adam said, if you're talking about international negotiations, or if you're talking about one-on-one commercial negotiations, I don't think that anything really beats the face-to-face interaction. And I'm sure that is going to come back once we see a lot of the travel restrictions lifted. But there will be, I think, a reduction in business travel for a certain period, for sure. Milan, on that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to drop off. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really very much enjoyed it, and I hope that we can engage again in the future.
I hope so, definitely. Yeah, thanks very, very much, Michael, for taking your time to discuss this hotly debated topic here with us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and we will just continue some of the questions with Adam, and maybe on that note, because Michael mentioned it a little bit about like short haul flights versus long haul flights, and there's clearly like a difference in how essential one versus the other can be. Also depending obviously on the reason why you fly, but especially short haul flights are something that where there is an alternative, right? most people obviously wouldn't want to take the boat to get to the States from Europe or vice versa. But let's say within Europe, because the rail network is fairly well developed, or within East Asia, there are actually alternatives. The elephant in the room are always the long-haul flights, but I was wondering on the short-haul flights whether, for example, is there is there a fair competition between, let's say, taking the airplane versus taking the train? I know many people fly on super short distances simply because airplanes are airfares are cheaper than taking the train, for example. Is there any perspective for, let's say, short-haul flights to use to? Maybe there's a couple of questions that came up online regarding electric planes. Would you be happy to comment on that?
Yes. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, for long haul, there simply isn't a substitute when going across oceans. People don't have that time to go on a boat. For regions where there are effective rail networks and high-speed rail, it does make sense to take the train. And part of that Mission Possible report that I mentioned earlier states that there could be some shift, perhaps as much as 10% of aviation travel going towards rail by 2050. That could be a way to reduce some of the aviation demand. That's not what I'm advocating, but that is a solution for some of the trips that are occurring now. And I think we're seeing that among millennials in Europe. There were a number of airports before the pandemic crisis that were reporting flat or even slightly decreasing travel demand for the first time in many years during an up economy. And that's really unusual, and it has to do potentially with the negative stigma of flying and flight shaming. So there is the ability to shift to rail for some of the potentially even medium haul flights. The other possibility is electrifying flying for short haul, and that is a technology that will be viable for smaller aircraft. It may change the airline model where you've got smaller aircraft that are flying with fewer passengers to a more diverse set of routes and even to smaller airports. So that's something that's encouraging, and we could see a real difference in the next 10 to 20 years for that technology. I'm advising, full disclosure, I actually advise an electric aircraft startup in the US and have seen firsthand that this is something that's promising. I think with electric aircraft, it's not just about reducing carbon emissions, it's reducing the air quality emissions, including lead. As people may know in this meeting, there's lead as part of avgas. So the piston aircraft, the propeller aircraft, are flying on a really old fossil type of fuel that is more highly polluting. So if we can get the lead out, so to speak, we can shift to electric aircraft, that will be effective. And there is no alternative. So there isn't a sustainable aviation fuel for these piston aircraft. The market is too small. The oil majors have actually pulled out, such as Shell and BP, and decided they're not going to make an alternative because they see the writing on the wall. The electric aircraft will take over this market. But let's keep in mind that short haul they comprise less than 10% of the emissions. So we still need the solution for the larger aircraft that are traveling further. That's important. So yes, rail could cover some small amount of the medium and short haul flights. Electric aircraft could cover the short haul flights in the next 10 to 20 years, and that will be a welcome development for air quality. But the bulk of the energy requirements will come from large aircraft flying on liquid fuel.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about potential of reduction emissions, and we're basically more on the side where everything that's possible is very much under where we actually have to get to. So only in the very best case scenario, we would actually meet our targets. And we've talked about like carbon offsets as like an intermediate solution, although there's obviously hardly debated whether this actually leads to reduction of absolute emissions or not. Well, very likely not, and actually increases that. But so given the current situation that actually many of the airlines are dependent on national governments, what do you think would be the best regulation that a hypothetical government could come up with to basically impose on airlines to actually basically shift this probability of this is the range of emissions that we get, but actually we need to get here, to actually really give this a big push?
Yeah, so the push is important, and I think the push actually comes from incentive and support, and a recognition that aviation is actually in a different set of circumstances than other transport sectors. So with trucking, we know that electrification is possible. We've seen developments with that, and for intercity trucking, in the next 10 years, there will be a large number of fleets that will be electric. And for shipping, ammonia looks like it's going to be a cost-effective alternative fuel. There are some shorter distance trips that can be made electric with electric vessels. Aviation, as I've said before, requires the liquid solution. So instead of governments putting more restrictions, they could, like in Europe, put a mandate on the blending levels, and that would create a level playing field. The airlines are not as opposed to a blending mandate. So then the producers of the oil have to create a certain percentage of their volume as alternative and lower carbon. And that will make it so the airlines are all purchasing from these fuel producers, and they all have the same economic cost. And those costs will be then passed on ultimately to the passengers, to people who are purchasing air freight. But it does create a level playing field, and it has been more acceptable to the European carriers. There are other jurisdictions where it's difficult to imagine that a national government would make that attempt, certainly not in the United States at the moment, perhaps in the future. But the blending mandate seems to be the policy that may create the least amount of friction, at least in the aviation industry. Oil majors, they beg to differ. They probably have some other reasons not to like this. But from an aviation perspective, if there was one policy and it was a restriction or a mandate, likely the most helpful one would be a blending mandate. And that is being implemented in the Netherlands, in France, in Spain, in some of the Nordic states. That is going forward. So we'll see what happens with that. And it only covers a percentage of the traveler emissions. So if you're a climate leader and you're a business that wants to address 100% of your emissions and get to net zero as soon as possible, you're going to need another solution. It won't just be the blending mandate.
Mm. Yeah, very interesting. So, I mean, I guess basically all the calculations that we've currently done on like how much do we need to decarbonize the whole aviation and actually to go to net zero. How much is that affected now by behavioral change after COVID-19? So, I mean, we now know that, well, there will very likely be a lot of meetings be held online simply because suddenly people were forced to, and now they kind of got used to. They realized for actually maybe a certain amount of meetings, it is totally feasible. It's better in terms of time, in terms of money, if people have carrying responsibilities and so on and so forth. It's just a bit more convenient for, let's say, at least some kind of fraction of flights that we usually would have taken to replace them with virtual meetings. How do you think this forecast of, we have twice as many passengers within the next 15 years is actually changed due to not just COVID, but also the possibility that at any point in time there could be the next pandemic?
Yeah, I think the pandemic and the lingering effects psychologically, whether it's perceived risk or actual risk, will have a lingering impact on aviation. So there's some questions around, can we protect the travelers and make them safe and reduce the possibility of transmission? I think we'll see some developments. Maybe there'll be new fashion masks that have tighter seals and are more comfortable. This is an opportunity. So entrepreneurs on this call, if you've got a product, it just may have a lot of potential for travelers who want to get back in planes. But yeah, I think that there could be concerns around flight hygiene. I think that will be more of a factor than concerns about people's climate impact. One of the programs that RMI manages is called the Good Traveler, and it's a voluntary carbon offset program. And contrary to what you said, Milan, we do believe that there are ways to do offset projects that are credible, robust, that have buffers and ensure that the carbon reduction happens. But again, we do believe that that's of less of a priority than decarbonizing the fuels. But I'm getting back to what in our experience, only 1% or less of passengers are taking these measures to decarbonize voluntarily, to go through additional steps. How much of a priority is this? And among millennials, it's a higher priority. And maybe it's a large amount, maybe it's a plurality of millennials eventually will have this concern and think about it while they're flying. Maybe if we could give them the option of buying sustainable fuels and truly decarbonizing, they would feel more confident about their travel. But there isn't the option there. If they wanted to travel on lower carbon fuel, they couldn't. So let's make that possible for them. And then they can choose their measures between lower carbon fuels and safer masks. They can start flying again. But yes, I do think that there will be impacts from COVID, and they probably will be more significant lingering effects than increasing concerns about climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just today or a couple of days ago that the UK government announced that from, I think, Monday onwards, there will be mandatory face masks in public transport. So I would assume that basically once flying becomes more normal again, that some kind of similar regulations would be also for aviation. However, I don't really see a full aircraft, everyone with masks, and that is considered to be safe enough. So is there anything that where the airlines actually prepare for, I don't know, one person sitting every second seat, or just shifting more people into business class where there's more distance? And I mean, I assume then this was either increase the prices or simply mean that the airlines can't fly economically anymore. What do you think will be the first reaction after flying becomes more normal again of the airlines to address the safety aspect?
So I live with a physician. So my wife is in global health, and she's been looking at the risk factors and the science around transmission. So I do have vicariously some insights into protection, and agree that there right now are insufficient mechanisms for safety of flying. The available masks that are on the market aren't good enough. They're not comfortable enough, and maybe that needs to be mandated with passengers. There are certain states in the United States where they're requiring masks in businesses, in stores and restaurants. That certainly could happen with aviation. So if we could effectively address those vectors, so the way that the disease is transmitted, possibly we get into these suits right before we get in the aircraft, and it's right in the holding area, or right before you get on to the gate. And you change into the suit, and you wear that suit while you're on the aircraft. You then get off the aircraft, and your bag is also in an outer enclosure, and you have gloves for the trip. You discard all of those upon exiting the aircraft. One could imagine that if passengers were willing to deal with this inconvenience and put up with it for the benefits of faster travel, that we would find a way to make this work. So I am convinced that there are ways to manage the transmission risks. They may be less convenient for passengers, but for people who benefit from air travel, we expect that they would be willing to put up with them. And maybe there's a hesitancy on an airline basis to say, well, we don't want to be the first mover, because it's, again, all cost when there's no money in the industry. So maybe we have to see something on the regulatory side that says, look, we've tested this out. We've seen that the suits and the bag enclosures and people's gloves and masks together are reduce the risk by 99.9%. That's good enough.
Yeah, very interesting. And I mean, I guess it is probably more the first group of people that will start flying again will be the frequent flyers, right? Because everyone else is kind of postponing their summer holidays, and well, kind of thinking about more local alternatives where you can get by car as the easiest option. And so on this point of frequent flyers, there's another question here coming in that I find quite interesting, is that, and just read it out. Is there any reason the airline industry won't accept, and therefore push governments to accept, the frequent flyer levy? Does it have any drawbacks? Because at the moment, and this is here written down as seems fair and widely accepted by NGOs, at the moment there is actually a couple of companies that basically are thinking about how to make the carbon emissions of their company, which is then again largely dominated by long-haul flights, and it's usually the more senior people, the more senior the people are, the higher their carbon footprint is compared to their colleagues. And so actually it's the companies, or let's say institutions like academia and so on, are more thinking about, is there a way that within the company we can regulate so that we basically don't allow the senior person to fly that much, but instead the people that actually still need to boost their career to let them fly more. And so this is suddenly a regulation, like an internal regulation that comes from that's on the demand side and not on the provider side. So is there any reason that the airline industry won't accept such a frequent flyer idea?
I think when you talk about the international nature of aviation, as Michael had shared during his presentation and follow-up questions, the challenges of getting any agreement are daunting, and it takes such a long time to develop. So maybe on the flip side is, how can we address the demand side players? What we saw in the electricity market, I brought up the renewable energy credit as a model for a sustainable aviation fuel credit, a SAF-C. The analog we also can draw from that is the corporations were buying these RECs before as the best practice, but then they realized, wow, instead let's invest in the production capacity, so new solar and new wind. And there's something called in the US a Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, REBA. There's an analog in Europe. This has allowed matchmaking between the corporations and the wind and solar developers to unlock new capacity. So they're not just buying the units, they are responsible for additional generation. So why am I bringing that up? Because there's the possibility for corporations to participate in the fuel market in the same way. They can make direct investments in new production capacity. They could buy a credit that would be tied to future production, or make a long-term commitment with a producer. I think this voluntary pathway holds more merit than an international requirement on frequent travelers. So if there's a firm that has a high proportion of travel, if that's professional service firms, investment firm, or another type of group, a tech firm, instead they can make these investments in production capacity. That would be more promising than waiting for an international agreement regulating frequent flyers.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. There's another question that comes in about something that we talked about in the beginning, which is the whole idea about carbon offsetting. And so the question is, can we hear more about the types of carbon offsettings that airlines currently use? I can't even remember when EasyJet announced, hey, we're just offsetting everything, what kind of offsetting they were talking about, and how do these offsetting schemes actually then compare to what the Good Traveler that you also talked about recommends?
Yeah, so the key with offsets is getting a credible verified offset. So is there a third-party registry that measures the carbon reduction where it gets retired, and is there a validator for the project developer on the start of the project? There are credible projects, and CORSIA is actually focused on market-based measures or offsets. So they have identified ones that are acceptable to aviation, and those actually need to create a measurable carbon reduction that's not counted towards the nationally determined contribution, the NDCs. So there is the ability to avoid double counting. That's really important. To have a verified offset that occurs and have that retirement be measured in a registry. So if all those conditions work, then CORSIA credits actually have the possibility of reducing emissions. Now, there's always the question of additionality. Would that project have occurred? Would they capture methane, for example, at a biodigester at a livestock or a cattle lot? Would the landfill gas be capped? Would it have occurred automatically? If it would through regulation, then it's not additional. So I think there's some risks around additionality and making sure that the unit would not have been reduced, the emission unit would not have reduced otherwise. And then leakage potential for the carbon offsets to occur in one industry, but to cause emissions growth in another industry. And then the possible elimination of forests that were otherwise protected or burned down due to natural circumstances. These are risks that are being addressed right now by the industry. They're creating buffers. So if you buy, for example, a nature-based offset, some portion of forest beyond your acre or hectare will be protected based on the risk factor for that forest. So I think if people buy these credible offsets that are verified, and those ones are the only projects that can occur in the Good Traveler are verified quality offsets. And likewise, Corsia will have those quality offsets too. There's a question then of vintage. When did the project actually occur? Could it be additional if the emission reduction happened before 2016? Then it looks like financially, someone's been holding that cost of the project for a while, and it's questionable whether it's additional. So ideally, people buy new vintages. That's one of the questions I think still in Corsia, and a way to help ensure credibility with offsets. And I should also add that even if we had 100% of aircraft flying on sustainable fuels, there still are some atmospheric effects. Those could be addressed through offsets, quality offsets. We have water vapor, induced cloudiness that creates additional warming effect. And while it's diminished with sustainable fuels, it still exists. So even with zero carbon fuels in the future, we'll have those impacts that need to be addressed. So aviation will be relying on sequestration or carbon removal from another source for a while to be truly sustainable.
Yeah, very interesting. I think this is exactly what you were just talking about, is exactly this idea of, although if you just look at the carbon, like the direct carbon emissions of the whole aviation industry, you might come up with a number of like about 3% of the global of global emissions. But like once you include these indirect effects, you can actually get much higher, and there's so much uncertainty around it that it's really difficult. And I know from myself that whenever you calculate a carbon footprint for flights, there's actually a couple of calculators that increase the grams of CO2 equivalent per kilometer depending on the flight altitude, and the flight altitude just increases the further you fly. So actually, let's say a short haul flight is per kilometer better than a long haul flight, and so that makes obviously everything really, really complicated. And I assume that whenever it comes to these offsets, that actually airlines probably rather tend to zero count than to double count. So I'm actually not worried about having any like double counting that is I don't know, significant and actually makes things worse. Definitely not. So as we're approaching 3:30, at least in my time zone, I would like, I mean, first of all, I would definitely love to thank you for this fascinating discussion. Obviously, thanks, Michael, who is probably already in the next meeting. And I don't know, Adam, do you want to have any concluding remarks to make? Otherwise, this is your last chance to get your opinion out in the world.
Thank you, Milan. Yeah, so instead of flight shaming for all those participants on this meeting and webinar, that it's channel that energy into figuring out ways to increase sustainable aviation fuels, and know that there is possible to decarbonize flying, and it can be done sustainably. There are waste-based feedstocks, there are technologies that have merit. They just need more investment and willingness to pay.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam, for having you. And yeah, thanks everyone out there who was listening for the last hour and a half. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we wrap up, I would just like to announce that we have a next event within the Oxford Climate Society, which is on the storytelling and climate activism. It's happening on Monday at 7:30 British Summer Time, so UTC+1. Which is with Bill McKibben, who is the world leading environmental activist and founder of 350.org, which you may have heard of, and together with Megan Mayhew-Berkman, who is an environmental author. So check that out. You can find more information on our Facebook page, on our website, and so on, or just basically show up at the right time in our YouTube channel, and you will you will have access to this event. Yeah, and so thanks everyone for coming around. Thanks, Adam. I hope to see you next week. Enjoy your weekend. Take care, everyone, in these difficult times, and stay safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Juan.
Bye, Adam. Take care.
Bye.